Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome today Professor Ruba Salih. Professor Salih is our second Mahmoud Darwish visiting professor in Palestinian studies. We are hosting three female Palestinian professors of Palestinian studies at Brown, Rima Hamami, Ruba Salih, and Noura Erakat. Professor Ruba Salih is she's professor at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her research interests and writing cover transnational migration and diasporas across Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, Islam and gender, the Palestine question and refugees. She has been a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge and at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. Professor Salih, Ruba, is the author of Gender and Transnationalism, Home, Longing and Belonging Among Moroccan Migrant Women. And I should say that I've known Ruba for a very long time when we were both PhD students in the late 90s. And at the time, Ruba was working on the book. She's also author of Musulmane Rivelate, Donne Islam Modernità, which won the Premio Posada Prize in 2011. Currently, she's working on a book on the aesthetics of waiting and the politics of return among Palestinian refugees, which is to be published by Cambridge University Press. Among her many publications are two co-edited special issues with Sophie Richter-Devro, one of them Palestine and Self-Determination Beyond National Frames, Emerging Politics, Cultures and Claims in the South Atlantic Quarterly, published in 2018, and Cultures of Resistance in Palestine and Beyond on the Politics of Arts, Aesthetics and Effect, which was in the Arab Studies Journal in 2014. Welcome, Ruba. It's wonderful to have you here today. So Ruba and I will be in conversation for about 45 minutes. You're welcome to leave your comments and questions in the Q&A function, and hope to have some time towards the end for discussion. So Ruba, when I look at your work over the last years, I see that in your overall work on Palestine, you are challenging us to think of Palestine beyond national and beyond nationalist frames. What does it entail for you?
First of all, thank you very much, Nadia. Thank you very much, Barbara, and everyone who helped organizing this event and the one taking place next week. I'm very grateful for the honor that has been given to me and to carry this title. Mahmoud Darwish Visiting Professor is both very moving and very a kind of a heavy duty. So first of all, I really wanted to thank you for giving me this opportunity. And so nice also to be here with you. Thank you for the question, which really allows me to take a step back and to give a sort of a framing for what is the topic of today's conversation, which revolves around nature, extinction, and what the Anthropocene can mean in the context of a settler-colonial context like the one of Palestine. And the reason why I'm saying this is really a good opportunity you offer me for my framing is because I think for a long time, as you mentioned, I've been interested in looking at trying and breaking the notion of homeland into the two sections or the two sectors that this notion entail, that is the relationship between home and land. And to me, this is really important, not only because I think by doing so, we are collecting the request and the legacy of feminist anthropologists of Palestine, and particularly of refugees, for example, Rosemary Zayeh, who is a pioneer feminist ethnographer of Palestinian refugees, who suggested a long time ago that there is, in Palestine studies, a need to historicize the home, gender, and sexuality by precisely registering the narratives, the actions, the gaps, the silences that nationalist traditions and nationalist understanding of our history and practices might raise. So, in other words, for a long time, I've been interested in looking at what kind of possibilities and potentialities does breaking homeland into home and land offer. And I see the idea of home as a horizon that allows us not only to understand the stakes that are there in the loss of home and homeland, and the different ways in which particularly women narrating their losses focus on a history of a home that is lost, that is the villages of 1948, the losses that the Nakba, and following that the Naksa, and the many other histories of displacement that these women have endured point to. But it's also the ability of particularly women, as a lot of my work focuses on women, the ability of women to constantly remake these homes away from home. And how do they do that? It is by looking at how sort of the way that women were protagonists of constantly reformulating, rebuilding shelters, rebuilding a sense of protection, a sense of meaning of life in the present time of dispossession and displacement. And beyond the nostalgia for that a lot of iconography of Palestine study has focused on, like the nostalgia for the loss of 1948 villages and land. So there is a sense in which, for me, on the one hand, accounting for the loss of home and the remaking of home is crucial. And in the same way, it is crucial to account for the other meanings of land beyond the idea of land as a material, and which is still really absolutely crucial. I don't want to deny, of course, the importance of the materiality of land and its loss. But there is another meaning that it is related to the affective, symbolic, and ontological notion and conceptualization of land, which is what I focus on in my recent work on the relationship between indigeneity and nature in Palestine.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So yeah, which leads us right into the work that we want to discuss and focus on. So when you move beyond the nation state frame, which seems to lead you to look more carefully at the idea of the Anthropocene in relation to settler-colonial contexts. And you wrote about the extinction of nature in Palestine. And I think you did this collaboratively with an expert in international politics of climate change. So I was hoping you could start out by explaining to us what the Anthropocene actually means and what is usually attached to it in relation to this idea of universal human extinction. And then, I guess, following up on that, how does a settler-colonial lens contribute to or challenge prevailing ideas around the Anthropocene?
Yes, thank you, Nadia, for the question. I think scholars of the Anthropocene, which obviously is not my main area of expertise because I come from the topic through a very fertile collaboration, but it is a sort of collaboration that allows me and allowed me to look at Palestine through a new lens. But I think that, to answer your question, the notion of the Anthropocene has been, of course, very much central in our in the last decade or more, given that we are told that we're facing, as you mentioned, like the risk of the extinction as a species. So basically, the notion of the Anthropocene, which is both a descriptive notion but also a very prescriptive one, implies that as humans have become decisively entangled in natural systems in a way that affect climate and in a way that allows human to make imprints on the planet, to put a signature, a very violent signature, they also simultaneously have become, in this process, a geological species agent, which is aware of its place in the deep history of planetary time. At the same time, this notion points to the ways in which, because of this, and because of the global so-called impact of so-called human activity on Earth systems and on the planet, any sharp distinction between nature and a human actor or spheres have become unsustainable. However, as you pointed out, this mainstream understanding of the Anthropocene is very much criticized and in a way reversed by scholars who have been looking at the violent erasures of settler-colonial enterprises historically. In fact, a lot of the scholarship coming from indigenous, brown, and decolonial scholars has pointed out, and not only, I have to say, has, however, pointed out that actually the Anthropocene is rooted in histories of settler-colonial violence and is therefore deeply tied up with the dispossession and extinction of indigenous life forms. In fact, there is a lot of discussion and contention around which date would signal the beginning of this process of human imprint on the earth. And the settler-colonial, so-called settler-colonial literature, if you wish, points to the idea that it's actually not incidental, that it is probably 1492, the date when the conquistadores first set foot in South America, that best probably signals the beginning of this era. And why so? Because the arrival of settlers and of the violent conquista of South America set in motion processes of violence, of disease, that actually decimated native populations by around 90%. So we begin to see here not only the relationship between settler colonialism and the changing of entire climates globally, but also the relationship between colonial violence and the extinction of indigenous populations, and of the relationship between indigenous and their conceptualizations of nature. So what is really important also to point out here is the ways in which there is an assumption in this mainstream understanding of the Anthropocene of a universal we, of a universal human species that is facing the threat of extinction on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is an assumption that this Anthropocene epoch in which we are supposedly living pushes us to reinterrogate our relationship with nature. In other words, we are intertwined with nature in a way that has never been so evident before. And this is the reason why we as species are called upon to do something about it. Now, obviously, having mentioned the triggering date of what, according to a decolonial scholarship, the Anthropocene should be sort of located into this particular time frame, we begin to see the aporia of this kind of mainstream understanding of Anthropocene. First of all, not only there is an assumption of a human species that is that erases hierarchical understanding and hierarchical constructions of the human that happen because of the colonization of most parts of the world, but also there is the erasure of the relationship between the knowledges and practices of indigenous communities around the world, whose relationship with nature has been always very much part and parcel of a way of living that is absolutely erased in this understanding of the Anthropocene. So in my work, together with Olaf Corey, I take the view that this notion of the Anthropocene could be and should be reinterrogated starting from the view of what I call the already extinct. And I know that I will have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this a bit later in the conversation. So what I want to underline here is that not only the settler-colonial violence and erasures has been intertwined with the ways in which certain humans have altered and erased entire life forms in some parts of the world, but also the way that this process has produced in itself a hierarchy of classes of entanglement between human and nature. In other words, who is human and what is nature is not a given, but is the result of settler-colonial ontological constructions of classes of humanities and the relationship with the natural world.
I see. Yeah, well, that reminds me of so Dipesh Chakrabarty, and you refer to the work, talks about the possibility that when faced with extinction, humans might develop an ethical consciousness as a virtue that allows the overcoming of the common threat we face. I mean, you were kind of putting it in different words earlier, but what is your take on that, on this idea of this ethical consciousness?
Well, I think I'm indebted to the reflection of Dipesh Chakrabarty in his Thunder Lectures, where he draws upon another time in history where we as humans faced the risk of extinction, which was around the 1950s, when the whole nuclear epoch was unfolding in front of our eyes, and the violence of nuclear war was unfolding with the end of the Second World War. Dipesh Chakrabarty borrows his notion of ethical consciousness from philosopher Karl Jaspers, who coined it actually in the 1950s, precisely while contemplating the potential and imminent destruction of the planet by the atomic bomb. And he conceives of this notion of ethical consciousness as the possibility that, faced with extinction and with the understanding of our very limited place in the sort of deep history of the planet, we could retrieve a sense of ethical, pre-political consciousness that can take us away from geopolitical divisions and what he calls intra-human politics or political conflicts. Now, for him, ethical consciousness is a horizon of action, a thought space, and I quote him, that came before and above and beyond politics, without, however, foreshortening the space for political disputation and differences. And for Chakrabarty, this idea of contemplating our extinction and what it has to trigger in us remains, in his view, a thought experiment in the face of an emergency that requires us to think in novel ways about our present and future, and novel ways about how do we compose the common. However, I think that coming into the topic from the viewpoint or from the vantage point of the colonized, or what I call the already extinct, or through the lens of decolonial indigenous thinkers, means acknowledging that rather than a single species impacting upon nature, as I mentioned, and threatening extinction for universal humanity, it is actually more appropriate to argue that the very possibility of human and non-human life is determined by past and ongoing colonial architectures of power. So what Chakrabarty calls sort of the possibility of an ethical, pre or post-political ethical consciousness that should bring us together, that is to say, a mood of common vulnerability, in our view, and this is what we do in this work, in this article we published in Environment and Planning, in our view, is a mode of common vulnerability that must reinforce and expand, if anything, rather than suspend or defer our attention to local and time-bound injustices. And in fact, we argue that recognizing such injustices that settler-colonial enterprises create should be a necessary prelude to facing in this ethical mood the common threat we face as a species. So we cannot really think of human extinction without recognizing that not only we have been created as different classes of humanity because of a very violent process that has taken place across the globe, across history, but also we have to pay attention to the ways in which, as it has been the case in Palestine, indigenous populations have historically been and continue to be dehumanized, disposed of, and violently erased or consigned to a space of non-life. And so in that sense, have already been extinct.
Yeah. Yeah, so I understand that. So what you're also contributing to is really a kind of new understanding or an expanded understanding of settler colonialism. I mean, so especially, I mean, settler colonialism in relation to Palestine. So you argue, if I'm understood rightly, that Palestine, and you said that before, has been studied most in relation to the displacement of the native population, but then go on to say, well, that is not enough to understand the work, the complex work that settler colonialism does in Palestine. So what does analyzing settler colonialism through the lens of nature add to our understanding of the Palestine question?
Yeah. But first of all, I think that something that would allow me to elaborate upon this, and I find very useful, is a quote that I would like to bring, and forgive me for the length, is a quote from the very well-known book by Meron Benvenisti, which was published in 2000, titled Sacred Landscape, The Buried History of the Holy Land since 1948. And there is in this book a very evocative quote by Joseph Weitz, who was a Polish Jew who sat in the first and second transfer committees between 1937 and 1948, and and these committees were formed to deal with what was coined at the time as the Arab problem, as it was defined, the presence of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on the land that the UN attributed to Israel in 1947. And Joseph Weitz was also the director of the Jewish National Fund's land settlement department from 1932 to 1948. And allow me to bring in this quote, because I think it's really what gives me a possibility to then analyze what the stakes are. Joseph Weitz writes the following: "And the road continues eastward between mountains and over mountains, and the Galilee is revealed to me in its splendor, its hidden places and folds, its crimson smile, and its green softness and its desolation. I have never seen it like this. It was always bustling with man and beast. And the latter predominated. Herds and more herds used to descend from the heights to the valleys of the stream beds, their bells ringing with a sort of discontinued sound, which vanished in the ravines and hid among the crevices, as if they would go on shimming forever. And the shepherds striding after them like figures from ancient times, whistling merrily and driving the goats towards the trees and bushes, to gnaw at them hungrily. And now the picture has disappeared and is no more. A strange stillness lies over all the mountains and is drowned by hidden threads from within the empty villages. An empty village. What a terrible thing. Fossilized lives turn to fossilized whispers in extinguished ovens. A shattered mirror, moldly blocks of dried figs and a scrawny dog, thin-tailed and floppy-eared and dark-eyed. At the very same time, a different feeling throbs and rises from the primordial depths, a feeling of victory, of taking control, of revenge, and of casting off suffering. And suddenly the whispers vanish and you see empty houses, good for the settlements of our Jewish brethren who have wandered for generations upon generations, refugee of your people, steeped in suffering and sorrow, as they at last find a roof over their heads. And you knew, war, this was our war. So I think this quote, long quote, actually lends itself to understanding the stakes of the colonization of Palestine, some of the issues I've talked about up until now, around the way in which the settler colonization of Palestine brings with itself a recasting, not only the erasure and the destruction of the previous life worlds, but also the construction of the indigenous and the indigenous relation to nature as a non-life, as the barren space, as a fossilized entity that is a non-life entity. And I think this is really important because it allows us to understand that at stake in settler colonialism, and Palestine is no exception, is not just a sort of elimination of the native, the logic of elimination of the native. And when I talk about elimination here, I don't at all mean, and never I use the word genocide or biological extinction of the native, but at stake is a sense in which the life world, the entanglement of the indigenous population to their nature, and the very notion of what is and when does nature emerge is at stake. Nature only emerges in the moment in which the colonizer appropriates the land and makes the desert bloom, as the famous statement wants it. But also, I think that in Palestine, like in many other settler-colonial contexts, the elimination of the indigenous or the erasure or the displacement of the indigenous population rested on much more than just the physical displacement of the people, and rested on much more than the destruction, the ecological alteration of the landscape. There is precisely this drawing of an equivalence between indigenous life and non-life, with human and non-human together fossilized or desertified by the ongoing settler-colonial project, which actually, and this is really crucial, we shouldn't forget the lesson of settler-colonial scholarship, like, for example, Lorenzo Veracini or the late Patrick Wolf, that describes and analyzes settler-colonialism not just as a process of appropriation and dispossession, but as a process by which the settler-colonial wants to make itself into the new indigenous. And in this process has to not just appropriate, dispossess, erase the indigenous population, but has to make itself into the indigenous or the non-indigenous population.
Yeah. I was, Ruba, I was struck by the title that you suggested for this talk, which points to a view from the already extinct in relation to debates about the Anthropocene. So I was wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that. Are you saying that Palestinians are extinct? I suppose not.
Of course, I'm not at all. Yeah. We are far from extinct, yes. Lucky. So as I was trying to hint at earlier, obviously the notion of extinction is in this context referring to the extinction of indigeneity, or the attempt at making the indigenous life world extinct. In other words, obviously, and we began this discussion and conversation by pointing to the many offerings that disconnecting home from land may offer. And looking at the notion of land by not just the lens of land dispossession and repossession, but through the kind of a possibility that interrogating what kind of the ontological constructions that went on in settler-colonial violent practices can offer us in terms of our understanding of the Palestine question and the forms of extinction that this brought with itself. So, referring to the late Patrick Wolf, of course, who argued that obviously extinction and settler-colonialism are always connected insofar as land is life, and therefore the expropriation and destruction or appropriation of land is necessarily a process of extinction and of death and destruction. And insofar as land is life, and at least land is necessary for life, appropriation of land is always about death. However, extinction in this context doesn't refer or doesn't equate to genocide or to death or physical extermination. Nor does it suggest, as I mentioned, that the Palestinian refugee community, for example, who constitute the core of the reflections that are present in the work that we are discussing today, it does not therefore suggest that the Palestinian refugee community is biologically extinct. On the contrary, far from it. The point I would like to make, and I hope I'm going to be allowed to make this point, is that we should look at the afterlife of nature in Palestine as a life of resistance and a life of where nature proves itself recalcitrant to its extinction. However, the making of the refugee problem is part of an ongoing process of forcing the extinction of Palestinian indigeneity. And an extinction in this context, therefore, points to a settler-colonial process that started in 1947 with the settlers' attempts thereafter to make themselves into the indigenous in Palestine by forcibly erasing indigenous life forms, as I said, and by consigning indigenous life forms to a space of non-life, to a barren, inert, non-living entity. However, as I will argue later, my argument is that this process is unfinished and constantly unsettled by the unruliness of nature itself, which triggers novel practices that somehow make this process a constant dialectic and a constantly unfinished project.
Mm-hmm. Ruba, before sort of pursuing some of these conceptual ideas further, I mean, I know you're an anthropologist, and I know that you have done, in-depth ethnographic research. So I was hoping you could share some concrete examples based on your own personal recollections and ethnographic work that illustrate the wider conceptual points you're making, particularly in relation to indigeneity and the destruction of natural and social habitats of Palestinian refugees.
Yes, absolutely. I am very keen, in fact, to move on to some of the more ethnographic dimension of these conceptual frames. But before doing that, I would like to just linger over for a few more minutes, for 1 minute or so, the ways in which I think the logic of extinction of indigeneity becomes very clear. And I would like to quote, for example, the words of Theodore Herzl, who very clearly, these are quotes taken from a lot of scholarship, both by Israeli scholars and Palestinian scholars, who have before me, and in many ways even much more competently than I tried to do in this article, which actually really focuses on Palestinian refugees' recollections of the natural world, very clearly have given us a sense of the stakes of the extinction of indigenous life forms beginning in 1947. For example, Theodor Herz very clearly sets the settler logic of displacing and replacing, which comes out with an alarming clarity when he said, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. This is Theodor Herz, cited in Patrick Wolf, 2006. And he offered a very clear understanding of what he meant by this, or the ecological imaginary that sustained this, what we call in the article, the emergence of a settler nature, which included piercing the hills, establishing chemical industries, producing energy for driving machines. So there is a sense in which this is Israeli ecological imaginary that sustained the erasure of the indigenous population was very much sublimated in a logic of destruction and reconstruction, which very often also took the image of an environmental ethics. For example, there is a whole literature on the environmental ethics of post-1948 and later, of planting trees and planting forests, but also through these practices changing the whole landscape, as Meron Ben-Benisti has very eloquently showed us in his work, and completely erase the indigenous landscape and bringing a new image and imaginary of what the land should look like. There was even attempts to engineer a European climate via afforestation. And when in 1959, Israel passed the Nature Preservation Goat-Induced Damages Law, it aimed at limiting grazing in order to engineer a shift to the so-called ecological climates, which it was claimed had been prevented by practices of the indigenous communities, such as grazing and herding. So I wanted to spend just a few more minutes lingering over the commonalities, like the mini local Anthropocenes that one can infer from such practices, if you wish. There is a lot of really interesting works, Susan Slimovich and others, and a lot of Israeli and Palestinian scholars who have really given us a wealth of scholarship that explores these dimensions in many different ways. However, to go to your very crucial question about the imaginaries and the kind of ethnographic takes on the role of nature, I was very struck when I started to reflect on the role of nature by the very loud absence of nature in the Palestinian scholarship, on Palestinian scholarship on refugees, despite the fact that both in my family's oral histories and in many of the interviews and work I did in and with refugees, the role of nature is actually, nature is quite ubiquitous in these recollections. There is a sort of inability to kind of look at this displacement in synergy with the displacement of sort of the population and the natural world. For example, my very uncle, when asked, when he was a child in 1948 and he was only 8 years old and from Jerusalem, and he was telling me the whole history of how children in some cases were taken away to protect them from the violence that was ensuing and unfolding, and asked, like, where did you go? Where were the children taken? He would say, we were taken to the trees, and the trees would protect us. We were put under the trees. Or many other recollections where of interlocutors who told me how in many instances where people were trying to escape or seek shelter, the olive groves or the citrus groves were providing a place to hide and to shelter from the ravages of war. So there is that level of presence of nature. And of course, there is the allegorical presence of nature in all of the Palestinian literature and iconography related to the memory and the scent and the sensory recollection of the lemon trees and the citrus and the lands. And my very mother's memoir focuses a lot on pre-48 life as a recollection of sensory and experiences of smell, of eating certain foods, of touching certain trees and so on. But my interest here is going beyond these kind of recollections and looking at how, in a way, the vegetation that Israel sought to make extinct with the expulsion of what Meron Benvenisti calls the human landscape, has become the site of unexpected practices in the present, which reaffirm the indigeneity of the Palestinian refugee population. So I'm interested in what the resurgence, the unruliness, the ability of this nature to keep popping up despite all odds. What can this popping up affords, and what kind of horizons and agency does this propel? So I can continue. There is a lot of examples that I would like to share with you.
Yeah, maybe if you could share a couple of examples. We have one question. I'll get to that question from the audience after, but maybe you can provide a couple more examples.
Yeah. So, for example, I mean, first of all, let me, in this article I published, I tried to look at diverse sources. So I'm looking at my own family recollection. I'm looking at Palestinian refugees recollections over work I conducted for over 10 years in camps with in a lot of different places, but also on Palestinian scholarship and writings and renditions. And one such clear rendition, I think, comes from, for example, the literature and the work of Palestinian intellectual Raja Shehadeh, who writes about the experience of walking on the landscape of Palestine in at least two of his works. For example, Palestinian Walks, his book Palestinian Walks, Notes on a Vanishing Landscape, which opens with the realization that the familiar landscape of Palestine with its olive orchards, with these traditional green terrace cultivations, with the white stone houses, which had remained unchanged for centuries, have been altered. I mean, this kind of familiar landscape, which he says would have looked familiar to a contemporary of Christ up until not long ago, has been dramatically altered over the last decade or so. And he talks about his journey in another of his work. He talks, the book titled, or the article titled, "A Rift in Time: Travels with My Ottoman Uncle," which was published in 2010. He narrates the walking journey that he undertakes in the footsteps of his great grand uncle a century earlier, only to find that virtually none of the names, the places, the flora and the fauna described in his uncle's memoirs exist anymore. However, in Shehadeh's lyrics, he stumbles upon this resurging vegetation, even though none of the names and the houses, the flora and the fauna exists any longer. There is constantly the stumbling upon this resurging vegetation, the almond trees, the cactuses, that in his own words afford an ability to see what is no longer there, and affords him an ability to imagine that in that particular place there used to be a village, or there used to be life that is no longer there. So in his own words, it affords him to see what is no longer there. But most importantly, it not only does that job of bringing memory to life, it actually allows an ability to reimagine the present. So it's not only the work of memory, but it's the work of what this imagination that settler-colonialism had sought to erase, the power of imagining what the present could look like by restoring the past, has been curtailed as well. And this resurgent vegetation is what allows him to, what affords him with an ability to reimagine the present. And it is what I have seen time and again described in a lot of the practices of refugees, families who, until they could go back to their villages in a not too distant past, they would try and go and make the site of the ruins as a site of family visits, of rituals, of rituals that were not only and simply about reliving a past or imagining or celebrating the existence of a pristine, nostalgic memorialization of the natural world, but was actually made of new and novel practices triggered by the constant resurgent vegetation that kept popping up. And I'll give you an example. For example, there was a woman who told us the whole story of how her village, Al-Walaja, which was the village that was divided into two parts in 1948. One part remained in present-day Israel, and the other parts stayed within the west line, the West Bank, the west side of the armistice line. The 1948 part of Walaja was destroyed and reduced into ruins, but and then the second part of the village, the part that stayed within the West Bank, was seized when the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem were redrawn in recent years. However, this interlocutor of mine narrative was very much remembering the practices that until not so long ago, the family kept going back to Al-Walaja to attend to the resurgent vegetation, and around which they had built a shed where sometimes they tried to sleep in it and stay and rebuild a sense of a life there. The shed was destroyed because the Israeli had declared the land as an agricultural land. And so the family decided to cultivate instead. And so they continued going back until they were allowed to somehow, or trespassing the various architecture of the occupation to attend to the vegetation. And this kind of narrative have been repeated to me time and again. And again, it kind of allows us to make sense of the sort of ironic pattern that, in a way, nature resists its obliteration. There is this sort of unruliness of recalcitrance that calls for new practices in the present, and not just for an imagination of a past that is no longer there.
Which seems to be something that Palestinian artists are more and more engaging with, no? Sort of this sort of new forms of imagination. And you're referring to this as a bit as well. So I find that really fascinating. I had also a conversation with Gil Hochberg, who has written about, some of these new imaginations. But let me turn to the audience question now. So Zena Aga is asking, how can we understand decolonization as a project of futurity when much of the destruction of nature that occurred in 1948 continues on into the present?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, it's what I tried to do here. First of all, in the wider work, we never refer to 1948 as a finished as a finished history, but it's Nakba. Most of it, it's the ongoing Nakba. So I totally agree with you about the fact that we cannot talk about this as in the past tense, and that the kind of insurgent practices that we see at work here are limited and are constantly repressed by the devising of novel forms of repression and violence. However, I would like to answer this with an example by drawing from the work of Palestinian geographer Ghazi Falah, who I think has conducted a really interesting review of the ruins of the villages of 1948, and has noted in his work some ironic consequences of settler-colonial attempts of erasure. For example, the fact that in the immediate aftermath of 1948, the Israelis built forests on the ruins to cover for the debris. But the fact that the forest kept growing meant that after a while, it was no longer possible to go and finish the job of destroying the ruins of the villages, because that would have meant destroying the vegetation as well. I think it's kind of ironic in a certain way, the idea that nature has its own logic that escapes escapes total control. And I know that in the face of the sophistication of the violence that we are confronted with, this might be very mere consolations. But I also think that there are all kinds of ways in which Palestinians are resisting the erasure of their indigeneity. Nature is, there are a myriad of projects and of scholarship as well that is resisting this obliteration and affirming and confining the success of the settler-colonial project of indigenization. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the success of these very partial and fragmented types of resistances. But I think they're still really crucial for containing the process of expansion and of normalizing, finally, the success story of Israel. And I also think that, for example, at every time that we claim, in this case, our own vegetation as the indigenous vegetation, our own tatrees or embroidery as our own embroidery, every time we claim the Palestinianness of certain types of food, and every time we inscribe these sets of practices into our own indigeneity, we are exercising resistance and we are claiming our right to exist in the place and beyond.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but maybe just to conclude, so you mentioned it a few times. So is this what you're talking about when you speak about the recalcitrance of nature, which you put also in connection with the recalcitrance of indigeneity to erasure? I was wondering whether, in the concluding couple of minutes, you can reflect a little bit on that.
Can you reformulate the question?
Well, you have on several occasions referred to this idea of the recalcitrance of nature, and you're also speaking about the recalcitrance of indigeneity to erasure. And I was just wondering if you can, to conclude, and we just really have a couple of minutes, reflect a little bit on this idea of the connection and the idea of recalcitrance.
Yes, I think the best way to conclude perhaps is to to refer to a notion in Palestinian language, and which is both a word and that denotes, this word is sabr, which is both the Arabic name for the cacti fruits, but also means patience and also signifies endurance as a natural and human virtue. And in my view, the fact that this nature and the cacti fruit keeps resurging despite attempts at obliteration and erasure represents something that is much more than a nostalgic claim to a pristine or an authentic life form that pre-existed the settler-colonial intervention, as a lot of the times we tend to remember. But it precisely points to how indigeneity returns as and signifies an intimate form of reciprocation of native people to their vegetations, to their animals, an indigenous type of entanglement, which in itself has proved recalcitrant to its taming and to fossilization, as the quote at the beginning of this conversation pointed to. So I'd like to finish perhaps by reminding ourselves of the powerful and evocative meaning of this word sabr, which means both patience and which also refers to the untamed and recalcitrant nature of Palestine, particularly when it comes to the cacti fruits that signpost the past, but also calls for novel forms of imagination, novel practices, novel types of return to sites that have been destroyed. And this is what I would like to call the afterlife of nature in Palestine.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Ruba, for sharing your very original and insightful reflections in relation to the Anthropocene nature and displacement in Palestine. We will, of course, be in conversation, not next week, but this Wednesday. Please join us. Ruba will be organizing, hosting, and participating in a panel discussion on thinking Palestine via Ferguson and Standing Rock, radical kinship, and the intersectionality of struggles. And this will be also online at 1:30 p.m. EST on Wednesday. But at this point, thank you very much, Ruba, and also many thanks to the audience, and hope to see